Before we proceed to this story, tell us in the comment section where you are watching from. Meanwhile, if you like a content like this, do well to subscribe for more of this content. What happens when a neighborhood HOA president blocks a moving truck in broad daylight and tells a black family unloading groceries that they are not homeowners but visitors who don't belong there? The moment had already turned ugly before anyone realized how far it would go. Her voice rang sharp across the cul-de-sac. Confident, practiced the tone of someone used to being obeyed. She stood with her clipboard pressed to her chest, sunglasses low on her nose, scanning the family like an inspection rather than neighbors. The mother froze mid-step, a bag of rice slipping slightly in her arms. The father raised his hands instinctively, calm, measured, trying to keep his voice even. "We just moved in yesterday," he said quietly, but the woman shook her head, already dialing her phone. Visitors are not allowed to occupy residences without prior HOA clearance, she replied loudly enough for windows to open and curtains to twitch. "This property has been vacant for months, and I don't recognize you." Humiliation crept into the air, thick and suffocating. The children stood close, eyes wide, sensing danger they couldn't name. The neighbors watched from driveways, pretending to adjust car mirrors. Some whispered, others pulled out phones. The woman continued, unfazed, citing bylaws, sections, and fines, asserting authority, as if the paper in her hand gave her the right to decide who belonged. The father tried again, showing keys, mortgage papers still in the folder, but she waved them away. "Dismissive forged documents are common," she said smugly, and something in her tone shifted from procedural to personal. The mother swallowed hard, feeling heat rise to her cheeks, not anger, yet but shame. The kind that sinks deep when you realize you are being judged before you are heard. She whispered, "We saved for years for this home." But the woman laughed softly, shaking her head. "You people always say that." And that single phrase cracked the afternoon open silence, fell heavy. A neighbor gasped. Another looked away. The father's jaw tightened, but he stayed still because he knew how quickly calm could be twisted into threat. The HOA president stepped closer, invading space, demanding IDs, threatening to call the police. When a screen door creaked open down the street, an older man stepped out slowly. No rush, no panic, just quiet certainty. He adjusted his cap, eyes, sharp posture, straight, and walked toward the gathering with measured steps. He stopped beside the family, looked at the woman, and asked simply, "What seems to be the problem?" She barely glanced at him, annoyed. "I'm handling an HOA." "Violation, sir," she snapped. "These people are trespassing on private property without authorization." The man nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded document, and handed it to her. "The deed," he said evenly. "I've owned that house for 23 years. I rented it to them last month." The words hung suspended like a held breath. The woman blinked once, then again. Color drained from her face. Her fingers trembled, gripping the paper as she read. Reread, her mouth open, but no sound came out. Neighbors leaned forward. Phones rose higher. The mother felt her knees weaken, not from fear, now but relief, so sharp it hurt. The father exhaled for the first time in minutes. The HOA president staggered back, clutching her clipboard as if it could steady her eyes, rolled, and suddenly she collapsed, fainting onto the pavement chaos. Erupted neighbors rushed forward. Someone shouted, "Call an ambulance," but the family stood still, silent dignity intact, watching authority crumble under its own assumptions. And as the sirens wailed faintly in the distance, the older man turned to the family and said, "Welcome home." And in that moment, the entire block felt the weight of what had almost happened and what truth had just prevented, because power built on bias always collapses eventually, and when it does, it never falls quietly. The ambulance lights faded down the street, leaving behind an uneasy quiet that felt heavier than the shouting ever had. Neighbors stood clustered in small groups, murmuring, eyes darting between the family and the fallen clipboard, abandoned on the pavement, like evidence. The mother finally set the groceries down, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. The children clung to her legs, confused, whispering questions she didn't yet have words to answer. The father straightened his shoulders, forcing calm even as anger pulsed beneath his skin, because he knew eyes were still on them, always watching, waiting for a reaction that could be misread. The older man. The owner folded his hands behind his back, surveying the crowd with disappointment more than triumph. This should never have happened, he said quietly, not to scold, but to state a truth. And somehow, that tone cut deeper than yelling. A neighbor cleared her throat, offering a weak apology, saying she didn't want to get involved. Another admitted she thought about speaking up, but froze. The family listened, nodded politely, but inside something had shifted because belonging shouldn't require witnesses or paperwork or rescue by someone with authority. The father looked at the house, sunlight catching the windows, the place they had dreamed about, and realized moving in was only the beginning, because sometimes the hardest part isn't buying a home, it's surviving the moment someone decides you don't deserve it. And across the street, a few neighbors finally lowered their phones, understanding too late that silence is also a choice, and it always sides with power until truth forces everyone to look back at themselves. Morning arrived gently, as if the neighborhood itself was unsure how to proceed. Sunlight spilled across the cul-de-sac, warm and deliberate, illuminating everything that had been left unsaid the day before. The house stood quietly, solid and unmoving, its porch still bearing the faint marks where groceries had once rested and where dignity had been tested. Inside, the family moved slowly, deliberately, reclaiming the space room by room. Cups clinked in the kitchen, boxes were opened. Laughter, tentative at first, slipped through the halls like a promise trying to keep its word. Word traveled fast. By midday, the story had moved beyond whispers and phone videos shared in private group chats. It reached the HOA board, then the city, then people who understood exactly what had almost happened and why it mattered that it hadn't. Emails were sent, meetings were called. The bylaws that had been weaponized were suddenly scrutinized under bright light, their language exposed for how easily it could be twisted. Authority, once loud and unchecked, now found itself answering questions it could no longer dodge. The HOA president did not return to the street that day, or the next. Her clipboard remained a quiet symbol of overreach, now tucked away in someone's trunk, no longer a badge of power. The board released a statement, carefully worded, apologetic, defensive, but it wasn't the paper that mattered. What mattered was the shift. Fines were suspended, policies were reviewed. Mandatory bias training was announced, and for the first time, the family's names were spoken not with suspicion, but with respect. Neighbors began to knock on the door, not all of them, not suddenly, but enough to matter. One brought baked bread, another offered help unpacking. A few apologized without excuses, without justifications. The children rode their bikes freely down the sidewalk, laughter echoing where tension had once lived. No one stopped them, no one stared. The street watched. Yes, but this time it watched differently. The older man returned one evening, standing on the porch with a quiet smile. "This is your home," he said simply, as if sealing something that should have never been questioned. The father shook his hand, gratitude and resolve meeting in that single gesture. The mother stood beside them, shoulders lighter than they had been in days, finally able to breathe without bracing herself. That weekend, the family hosted their first small gathering. Nothing elaborate, just food, music, and open doors. Some neighbors came, some didn't, but the ones who did stayed long, listened closely, and learned something they hadn't known before, that belonging is not granted by permission, but by presence. That dignity does not ask to be recognized. It exists, whether acknowledged or not. As the sun set, casting gold across the windows once again, the father looked around the room filled with warmth, voices, and life. The fear that had once shadowed this place had loosened its grip, not erased, but diminished, replaced by something stronger, something earned. Victory had not come in the form of revenge or spectacle. It arrived quietly, in accountability, in truth spoken aloud, in a family standing unbroken in the place they chose to call home. And as the lights came on inside the house, warm, welcoming, unmistakably theirs, the street finally understood what real power looks like. At last, they were home.